The carriage jolted hard over a stone, and Elena Whitmore gripped the seat with both hands, her breath catching before she even understood why. It was not the bump in the road that frightened her. It was the sound of a man's voice from outside, low and commanding, calling to the horses. For one terrible second, it was not a driver's voice she heard. It was another voice, from another year, one she had spent every day since trying to forget. She forced her eyes open and looked at her gloved hands until the shaking stopped. Her mother had told her this was a chance, not a punishment. Grantham Hall needed a companion for the Duke's younger sister, and the wages would clear the debt hanging over their small house like a storm that never broke. Elena had not argued. She never argued anymore. She simply packed her one trunk and let herself be carried toward a life she did not choose. The hall rose ahead of her through the mist, its stone walls pale and enormous, its windows catching the weak morning light. Elena stepped down from the carriage on legs that did not quite feel steady, and a young footman took her trunk without a word. She followed him up the wide stone steps, telling herself that this was simply a house, and a house could not hurt her. Inside, the air was cool and smelled of beeswax and old wood. A tall woman in dark gray approached, her eyes moving over Elena the way a merchant studies a bolt of cloth before deciding its worth. "You are the new companion," the woman said. It was not a question. "I am Mrs. Bellwether. I run this household, and I expect you to remember every rule I give you the first time I give it." "Yes, Mrs. Bellwether," Elena said, keeping her voice even. "You will meet Lady Charlotte this afternoon. Until then, you will not wander the East Wing, and you will not speak unless spoken to in the presence of His Grace." Mrs. Bellwether's gaze sharpened. "Do you understand?" "I do." The housekeeper studied her a moment longer, as if she sensed something beneath the polite stillness of Elena's face, something she could not quite name. Then she turned and led the way down a long corridor lined with portraits of stern, unfamiliar faces. Elena kept close behind her, counting the doors as they passed, the way she always did in a new place. It was a habit she had built without meaning to, a way of knowing where the exits were, should she ever need one. She hated that she still did it. She hated that some habits never left, no matter how many years went by. They turned a corner, and Elena nearly walked into a man coming the other way. He stopped instantly, stepping back to give her room, and Elena looked up into a pair of gray eyes that studied her with quiet, unreadable attention. He was tall, dressed simply for a man of his station, his dark hair slightly disordered, as though he had run a hand through it while thinking. There was no need for Mrs. Bellwether to say his name. Elena knew, from the way the housekeeper straightened and lowered her eyes, that this was the Duke of Grantham himself. "Your Grace," Mrs. Bellwether said quickly. "This is the new companion for Lady Charlotte, Miss Whitmore." Elena dropped into a proper curtsy, her heart hammering harder than the moment required. It was not fear of him precisely. It was simply the nearness of any unfamiliar man, the way her body reacted before her mind had time to remind her that she was safe. "Miss Whitmore," the Duke said. His voice was low, measured, nothing like the voice that had startled her in the carriage. And yet Elena felt herself flinch, just slightly, at the sound of a stranger's greeting. She saw something flicker in his eyes, there and gone, as though he had noticed. "Your Grace," she managed. He said nothing further, only gave a small nod, and continued down the corridor. Elena let out a breath she had not realized she was holding. "His Grace does not usually speak to new staff so directly," Mrs. Bellwether said, sounding faintly suspicious, as though Elena had done something wrong simply by being noticed. "Come, Lady Charlotte will be waiting." They found Lady Charlotte in a bright sitting room at the front of the house, seated at a writing desk, with ink on her fingers, and a smile already forming before Elena had even been introduced. "You must be Elena," Charlotte said, rising at once. She was perhaps 19, with warm brown eyes and none of the coldness Elena had expected from a Duke's sister. "I do hope you like books, because I have far too many opinions about far too many of them, and no one in this house will listen anymore." Despite herself, Elena felt the corner of her mouth lift. "I like books very much, my lady." "Charlotte, please. My lady makes me sound like my grandmother." Charlotte studied her for a moment, her smile gentling. "You look tired. Was the road very long?" "Long enough," Elena said, and left it there. Charlotte did not press. She simply gestured to a chair by the window and began speaking of the house, the gardens, the small dog that belonged to the head groundskeeper and had taken to sleeping in the kitchen. Elena listened, grateful for the easy chatter, grateful to think of nothing but small, harmless things. It was near evening when the trouble began. Elena was crossing the entrance hall on her way to her room when the front doors opened and a group of guests arrived, laughing, shaking rain from their coats. Among them was a man Elena had never seen before, tall and handsome in the way that drew every eye in a room, dressed in fine clothes that spoke of wealth and confidence. He was laughing at something one of the other guests had said, and the sound of that laugh, sharp and self-satisfied, hit Elena like cold water thrown without warning. She stopped walking. Her hands went cold. The hall seemed to tilt slightly, and for one long, terrible moment, she was not standing in Grantham Hall at all. She was somewhere else, some years ago, hearing that same kind of laugh from a man who had never once thought of her as a person. "Miss Whitmore?" The voice cut through the fog, low and close. Elena blinked and found the Duke standing a few feet away, having apparently come from the library, his expression carefully neutral but his eyes sharp with attention. "Forgive me, Your Grace," she said quickly, straightening. "I was simply lost in thought." He did not look convinced, but he did not press her either. His gaze flicked once toward the new arrivals in the hall, then back to her face, as though he were comparing the two and drawing some private conclusion. "That is Lord Edmund Vane," he said, his tone giving nothing away. "He visits every autumn. You need not concern yourself with the guests, Miss Whitmore. Your duties are with my sister." "Yes, Your Grace." "Are you well?" The question startled her, coming from a man she had met only hours before, a man who owed her nothing beyond the wages promised in her contract. Elena looked up at him, searching his face for the kind of curiosity that so often turned cruel, the kind that wanted a story to laugh about later. She found none of it, only something quiet and watchful, something that made her want, foolishly, to trust him. "I am well, Your Grace," she said. "Thank you." He held her gaze a moment longer, then gave a small nod and continued on his way, leaving Elena alone in the hall with her heart still racing, and Lord Edmund Vane's laughter still echoing faintly from the far end of the corridor. That night, in the small, plain room given to her near Charlotte's quarters, Elena sat by the window and watched the dark shapes of the trees move in the wind. She thought of her mother's letter, tucked into the bottom of her trunk, full of gentle warnings to behave, to be grateful, to give the family no reason for complaint. She thought of the years she had spent teaching herself to smile at the right moments, to answer questions without answering the ones beneath them, to walk through rooms full of men and never let her fear show on her face. She had thought she was better at hiding it than this. A soft knock came at her door. Elena rose and opened it to find Charlotte standing there in a dressing gown, a candle in her hand and an apologetic look on her face. "I saw your light was still burning," Charlotte said. "I could not sleep either. May I come in for a moment?" Elena hesitated, then stepped back to let her enter. Charlotte settled onto the edge of the narrow bed as though they had known each other for years rather than hours. "You looked frightened this evening," Charlotte said gently. "In the hall. I saw it, even if my brother pretended not to notice." Elena's throat tightened. It was nothing. A moment's dizziness. Charlotte studied her with the same quiet patience her brother had shown, and Elena wondered, briefly, if it ran in the family. "You do not have to tell me anything," Charlotte said. "I only want you to know that this house is safe. Whatever you are carrying, you need not carry it alone here." Elena did not answer. She was not ready to answer, but something in her chest loosened, just slightly, at the kindness in Charlotte's voice, and for the first time since stepping off the carriage, she let herself believe that perhaps this house would not be like the others. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the old windows of Grantham Hall, and somewhere down the corridor, behind a closed study door, the Duke sat with a glass of untouched brandy, thinking not of his ledgers or his letters, but of the flicker of fear he had seen cross a stranger's face, and the question he could not stop asking himself. What was Elena Whitmore so afraid of? A door slammed somewhere above her, and Elena dropped the stack of linens she was carrying, her hands flying up as though to shield her face. It took a full breath before she understood it was only the wind, catching an upstairs window left open by a careless maid. She bent to gather the fallen linens, her cheeks warm with embarrassment, and hoped no one had seen. Someone had. "You move like a soldier expecting an ambush," Charlotte said from the doorway, though her tone held no mockery, only concern. She crossed the room and helped Elena scoop up the last of the fallen cloth. "I have watched you 3 days now. You flinch at doors. You never sit with your back to a room. You always know where the nearest way out is before you have even greeted anyone." Elena's hands stilled over the linens. "I did not realize I was so easy to read." "You are not to most people," Charlotte said. "But I notice things. It is rather my one talent, since I cannot sing and I am hopeless at cards." She sat back on her heels, studying Elena with the same patient warmth she had shown that first night. You do not have to tell me why. I only wish you did not have to carry it so quietly. Elena managed a small smile, grateful, but the words would not come. Some things had been buried too deep, for too long, to be dug up simply because someone was kind enough to ask. The morning passed in ordinary tasks, and for a while Elena allowed herself to believe the household had settled into something almost peaceful. She read to Charlotte in the garden. She helped choose ribbon for a gown Charlotte was having altered. She began, cautiously, to feel something like comfort in the rhythm of her days. Then the guests came down for luncheon, and Lord Edmund Vane was among them. He was seated near the head of the table, close enough to the Duke that Elena, standing along the wall with the other attendants, could hear every word he spoke. His voice carried easily, confident and pleased with itself, the voice of a man who had never once doubted his welcome in any room he entered. You keep a fine household, Grantham, Vane said, raising his glass slightly toward his host, though I confess I did not expect to find such a pretty new face among your staff. His eyes moved deliberately to where Elena stood, and he let his gaze linger a beat too long, the way a man does when he wants to be noticed noticing. Elena kept her eyes fixed on the far wall, her spine straight, her expression carefully blank. It was a skill she had built over years, the art of becoming invisible while standing in plain sight. But her heart was pounding so hard she was certain someone at the table must hear it. My staff are not for your amusement, Vane, the Duke said, his tone pleasant enough on the surface, but Elena caught the edge beneath it, sharp as a blade wrapped in silk. Vane laughed, unbothered, and turned the conversation elsewhere, but Elena felt his gaze return to her twice more before the meal ended, each time like a hand laid too familiarly on her shoulder. She excused herself as soon as she was able, slipping out through the servants' passage and into the kitchen garden, where the cold air helped steady her breathing. She pressed her back against the stone wall and closed her eyes, counting slowly, the way she had taught herself long ago, until the shaking in her hands quieted. Miss Whitmore, she startled, opening her eyes to find the Duke standing a respectful distance away, his expression unreadable, but his eyes searching hers with quiet intensity. Forgive me, Your Grace. I only needed air. You need not explain yourself to me, he said. He studied her a long moment, then added, more carefully, Lord Vane will not trouble you again in my house. I have already made that plain to him. Something in Elena's chest cracked, just slightly, at the unexpected kindness of it. She had spent so many years being told to smile through discomfort, to make herself smaller so as not to inconvenience powerful men, that a Duke's plain intervention felt almost disorienting. Thank you, she said quietly. You did not have to do that. I did, he said simply, and something in the way he said it told her he meant it as more than politeness. They stood a moment longer in the cold garden air, neither quite finding more words, until Mrs. Bellwether's voice called from the kitchen door, and the moment dissolved. Elena returned to her duties, but she carried the memory of his words with her for the rest of the day, turning them over like a small, warm stone. That evening, disaster came without warning, the way it so often did. Elena had been sent to fetch a shawl for Charlotte from the drawing room, and she had thought the room empty. She pushed the door open and stepped inside, only to find Lord Vane standing near the fireplace, a glass of wine in his hand, as though he had been waiting. Miss Whitmore, he said, his smile widening in a way that made her stomach drop. How fortunate. I had hoped for a moment alone with you. I only came for a shawl, my lord, Elena said, keeping her voice steady even as every instinct in her screamed to run. I will not trouble you. No trouble at all. He set down his glass and crossed the room toward her, closing the distance she had not given him permission to close. You are a rare thing in this house, you know. All this seriousness, all this careful quiet. I wonder what you are hiding behind it. Please step back, my lord. Her voice shook, despite her best effort to steady it. He did not step back. He reached out, his fingers brushing her arm, and the touch sent a jolt of pure panic through her chest, so sharp and sudden that for one terrible moment she was not in the drawing room at all. She was somewhere else entirely, trapped, unable to move, unable to speak. Vane. The single word cut through the room like a blade. Elena turned, gasping, to see the Duke standing in the doorway, his face utterly still, his eyes burning with a fury so cold it seemed to lower the temperature of the room itself. Vane stepped back at once, raising both hands with an easy, unbothered laugh, as though he had done nothing at all. Grantham. I was only offering the young lady some conversation. You will leave this room, the Duke said, his voice low and absolutely without warmth, and you will not come near Miss Whitmore again, in this house or any other. For as long as you value my friendship, which I promise you is not so valuable as you assume it to be." Vane's smile faltered for the first time. He glanced once at Elena, then back at the Duke, and something calculating passed behind his eyes, before he inclined his head and left the room without another word. The silence that followed rang loudly in Elena's ears. She realized her hands were shaking badly, and before she could steady herself, she felt her knees give slightly. The Duke crossed the room quickly, not touching her, simply standing close enough that she could steady herself if she needed to. "You are safe," he said quietly. "He is gone. You are safe, Miss Whitmore." Elena pressed a hand to her mouth, fighting the sudden, humiliating urge to cry in front of a man she had known only a handful of days. "I am sorry," she managed. I am not usually so foolish." "There is nothing foolish in being frightened by a man who deserved to frighten you," the Duke said, his voice gentler now than she had yet heard it. "I saw his hand on your arm. I will not pretend I did not." Elena looked up at him, searching his face for judgment and finding none, only a quiet, steady concern that undid something in her more thoroughly than kindness usually did. "May I ask you something, Miss Whitmore?" His voice was careful, as though he were stepping onto uncertain ground. "You need not answer if you do not wish to, but has something like this happened to you before?" The question hung in the air between them, and for one long moment, Elena considered simply saying no, the way she always said no, the way she had trained herself to deflect every question that came near the truth. But something about the stillness of the room, and the steadiness of his eyes, made the old, practiced lie feel suddenly too heavy to lift. "Yes," she whispered, "a long time ago." She said nothing more. She could not yet. But it was more than she had told anyone in years, and the Duke did not push for more. He simply nodded, as though she had handed him something fragile, and he understood exactly how carefully it needed to be held. "Thank you for telling me even that much," he said. "You are safe here, Miss Whitmore. I intend to see that it stays true." Elena did not know, standing in that quiet drawing room with her heart still racing, whether she believed him yet. But for the first time in longer than she could remember, she wanted to. The letter arrived at breakfast, and Elena knew before she even broke the seal that it would ruin her day. Her mother's handwriting slanted hard across the page, the way it always did when Margaret Whitmore was anxious about money. "You must not give His Grace any reason for complaint," the letter read. "Remember what is at stake for this family. Remember what we owe, and to whom. I trust you have not caused any trouble." Elena folded the letter and slipped it into her pocket, her appetite gone. She had not told her mother about Lord Vane. She had not told her mother about the panic that still gripped her at unexpected sounds, at unfamiliar men standing too close, at laughter that echoed the wrong way in her memory. Margaret Whitmore had enough worries of her own. She did not need to carry Elena's as well. Charlotte found her an hour later in the small library, staring at a book she had not turned a single page of. "Bad news from home?" Charlotte asked gently, settling into the chair across from her. "Nothing so dramatic," Elena said. "My mother worries. It is what she does best." Charlotte tilted her head, studying her with the same quiet perceptiveness Elena was beginning to expect from her. "You have not told her what happened with Lord Vane." "There is nothing to tell. Your brother handled it." "That is not what I asked." Charlotte's voice was soft, but there was steel beneath it, the same steel Elena had glimpsed in the Duke. "Elena, I do not wish to pry where I am not wanted. But I have watched you flinch at raised voices. I have watched you go still as stone whenever a strange man laughs too loudly. Whatever happened to you, it was not small, and it was not so long ago that it has stopped hurting you." Elena's hands tightened in her lap. She thought of all the years she had spent perfecting her silence, building it wall by wall until she almost believed it herself, that she was simply a quiet person, a careful person, nothing more. But sitting in this warm library, with a friend who asked nothing but honesty, the walls felt suddenly thinner than she had built them to be. "There was a man," Elena said slowly, each word costing her something. "Years ago, he was a guest in a house where I worked, much as I work here. He was of high standing, and no one questioned him, and when I tried to speak of what he did, I was the one who lost my position. My family needed the wages I sent home. I learned very quickly that the truth was not worth what it cost me." Charlotte's eyes filled with quiet fury on her behalf, but she did not interrupt. "Since then," Elena continued, her voice barely above a whisper, "I have been careful. I watch doors. I watch hands. I do not trust easily, because trust was the very thing that put me in danger before. I did not expect to feel safe here. I do not know that I still do. But your brother." She stopped, unsure how to finish the thought. My brother is not like Lord Vane, Charlotte said firmly. He has never once, in all his life, used his position to make someone smaller. It is why the servants love him, though he would be embarrassed to hear me say so. Elena managed a small, watery smile. I am beginning to see that. They sat together in comfortable silence for a while, until Charlotte rose and pressed Elena's hand gently before leaving her alone with her thoughts. Elena watched her go, grateful beyond words for a friendship she had not expected to find in a house she had been sent to only out of necessity. That afternoon, Elena walked the gardens alone, needing air and space to breathe. She did not notice the Duke until she nearly walked past him, standing near the old stone fountain with a letter in his hand, his expression troubled. Your Grace. She dropped a small curtsy, startled. Miss Whitmore. He folded the letter and tucked it away, though not before Elena caught sight of Lord Vane's name written across the top. I did not mean to intrude on your walk. You are not intruding. This is your garden after all. She managed a faint smile, and to her surprise, he returned it, briefly, the expression softening the sharp lines of his face. May I walk with you a moment? He asked. There is something I wish to discuss, if you are willing. Elena nodded, and they fell into step together along the gravel path, the autumn air cool and crisp around them. I have been making inquiries about Lord Vane, the Duke said carefully. Since the incident in the drawing room, I could not simply let the matter rest. I wrote to acquaintances in London who know him better than I do. Elena's steps slowed. And what have you learned? That you are not the first young woman to find yourself cornered by him, the Duke said, his jaw tight with restrained anger. There have been others. Servants, companions, women without the standing to be believed when they spoke against him. In every case, the matter was buried, and Vane's reputation remained untouched. Elena felt the blood drain from her face. It sounds terribly familiar. I imagined it might. His voice gentled. Miss Whitmore, I do not ask you to relive what happened to you before, but if you are willing, I would very much like to know more of what occurred in that drawing room, and whether you would be willing to have it recorded, quietly, as part of a larger account against Vane. You would not be alone in this. There would be others willing to speak, now that they know they would not be speaking alone. Elena's heart pounded, old fear rising sharp and immediate at the very thought of speaking against a powerful man again, of risking everything for a truth that had cost her so much before. But she looked up at the Duke's steady, patient face, and she saw none of the impatience, none of the doubt, that she had faced the last time she tried to tell the truth. I am frightened, she admitted quietly. The last time I spoke against a man like him, I lost everything. My position, my reputation, nearly my family's trust. You will not lose anything here, the Duke said, his voice low and certain. I give you my word, Miss Whitmore. Whatever comes of this, you will have a place in this household for as long as you wish it, regardless of what you choose to say or not say. Elena studied his face for a long moment, searching for any hint of the calculation she had learned to expect from powerful men, and finding instead only quiet, unwavering sincerity. I will think on it, she said finally. I am not yet ready to say more, but I thank you, Your Grace, for believing me without proof, when so few ever have. You did not lie to me, he said simply. I saw enough with my own eyes to know that. They walked in silence for a while longer, the fountain's soft splash the only sound between them, and Elena found herself, for the first time in years, imagining a future where the truth did not have to cost her everything. That evening, as the household settled for supper, word came that Lord Vane had been seen speaking urgently and privately with several of the other guests, his usual confident charm noticeably strained. Charlotte reported it to Elena with poorly hidden satisfaction. He knows something is happening, Charlotte said. He is trying to secure allies before the ground shifts beneath him. Elena felt a flicker of fear at the thought of what a cornered man like Vane might do, but beneath the fear, something new was growing, small but steady. For years she had believed that silence was her only protection. Now, for the first time, she wondered if the truth, spoken carefully and among people who believed her, might protect her instead. Later that night, unable to sleep, Elena sat by her window and watched the lamplight flicker in the study below, where she knew the Duke was still awake, still working to build a case that might finally hold a man like Vane accountable. She thought of her mother's warning to cause no trouble, and for the first time, she allowed herself to disagree. Some troubles, she thought, were worth causing. A knock came at her door, softer than Charlotte's usual knock. When Elena opened it, she found one of the younger maids standing there, pale and anxious. Miss Whitmore, the girl whispered. Lord Vane is asking for you. He says it is urgent, and he will not take no for an answer. Elena's blood ran cold, and somewhere below, she heard the unmistakable sound of Lord Vane's voice, closer than it should have been, calling her name down the darkened corridor. Elena's heart slammed against her ribs as the footsteps drew nearer, unhurried and confident, the footsteps of a man who had never once been told no in a way that mattered. She stepped back from the door instinctively, her hand searching for anything solid to steady herself against. "Go and find his grace," she told the young maid, keeping her voice as level as she could manage. "Quickly, now. Do not stop for anyone." The girl fled down the servant's stair, and Elena was left alone in the corridor, as Lord Vane rounded the corner, a glass of wine still in his hand, his eyes glassy with drink, and something colder beneath it. "There you are," he said, his voice pitched low and pleasant, as though this were an ordinary conversation between old friends. "I have been looking for you all evening, Miss Whitmore. You have been avoiding me." "My lord, it is late. I must return to my room." Elena kept her voice steady, though every part of her wanted to run. "Not yet." He stepped closer, and Elena backed toward the wall, her mind racing through every exit she had counted since her first day in this house. "I only wish to talk. You have been unkind to me, you know, running to Grantham with your little complaints. I only offered you conversation." "You touched me without my consent, my lord. That was not conversation." His expression flickered, something ugly moving beneath the polished surface. "You forget yourself, girl. Do you know how easily a word from me could see you turned out of this house without a reference? Without a single coin? Your family would starve on the street before the season ends." Elena's chest tightened with old, familiar fear, the exact threat that had silenced her once before. But something had shifted in her these past days, something built from Charlotte's steady friendship and the Duke's quiet, unwavering belief in her. She thought of her mother's letter, of the debt hanging over her family, and she thought, too, of the other women Vane had silenced before her, women who might never get the chance to speak at all. "You may try," Elena said, her voice trembling but clear, "but I am no longer alone in this house, my lord. And I do not think you understand yet how much has already been learned about you." Vane's face darkened, and he reached for her arm, his grip far rougher than it had been in the drawing room. Elena cried out, twisting away, but his hold was firm, and panic rose in her throat so sharply she could not find her voice to scream. "Release her." The Duke's voice cracked through the corridor like a whip, and within seconds he had crossed the distance between them, seizing Vane's wrist and forcing his grip loose with a strength that left no room for argument. Vane stumbled back, wine sloshing from his glass, his composure finally, completely broken. "Grantham, this is hardly your concern. She is under my protection, in my house, and you have laid hands on her twice now." The Duke's voice was low and absolutely without mercy. "You will pack your belongings tonight, and you will be gone from Grantham Hall before the sun rises, or I will see to it personally that every door in London closes to you before the week is out." Vane's eyes flicked to Elena, cold and calculating even in his humiliation. "This is not finished." "It is finished," the Duke said. "You simply have not yet accepted it." 2 footmen appeared at the Duke's signal, and Vane, seeing the futility of further argument, allowed himself to be escorted away, muttering threats that grew quieter with distance until they faded entirely. Only then did the Duke turn to Elena, his expression shifting from cold fury to something far gentler. "Are you hurt?" His hands hovered near her arms, careful not to touch without permission. "Elena, look at me. Are you hurt?" It was the first time he had used her given name, and something about the softness of it, paired with the raw concern in his eyes, undid the last of her composure. She pressed a hand over her mouth, trembling, and he simply stood close, steady and patient, until the worst of the shaking passed. "He said he would ruin my family," she whispered. "He said one word from him, and we would starve. He has no such power left, not tonight, and not after what I intend to do next," the Duke said firmly. "Elena, I need you to trust me. Will you tell me everything now? What happened to you before, and what happened tonight? I promise you, on my family's name, that the truth will not cost you what it cost you the last time." Elena looked up at him, at the steady certainty in his gray eyes, and she felt something inside her finally give way, not in fear this time, but in relief. "Yes," she said, "I will tell you everything." They sat together in the small library long into the night, Charlotte joining them with a shawl for Elena's shoulders and quiet, steady support in her presence. Elena spoke slowly, haltingly at first, of the household where she had worked before, of the guest who had cornered her much as Vane had, of the accusations that had turned against her instead of him when she dared to speak the truth. She spoke of losing her position, of the months of hardship that followed, of teaching herself never again to trust a room simply because it looked safe. The Duke listened without interrupting, his jaw tight, his hands clenched on his knees as though restraining himself from some anger he could not act on so many years too late. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "I am sorry that happened to you," he said finally. "I am sorry no one believed you then. I believe you now, completely, and I intend to see that this time, the truth is not buried." "What will you do?" Elena asked. "Tomorrow I will send for the magistrate and lay out everything I have gathered, along with your account and the accounts of the others who have come forward. Vane's reputation has protected him for years, because no one has been willing to stand together against him. That ends now." Elena felt a fragile, unfamiliar hope stirring in her chest. "And if it fails, if he finds a way to twist it again, the way the last man did, then you will still have a place here," the Duke said firmly. "That promise does not depend on the outcome. It never did." Charlotte squeezed Elena's hand gently. "You are not alone this time. Remember that." Elena looked between them, at the steady warmth in Charlotte's eyes, and the quiet, unwavering resolve in the Duke's, and for the first time in years, she allowed herself to believe that perhaps this time, speaking the truth would not cost her everything. Perhaps, this time, it might finally set her free. Outside, the night wind rattled softly against the windows, and somewhere in the guest wing, Lord Edmund Vane packed his belongings in furious, humiliated silence, already scheming for a way to turn the coming days back in his favor. But for the first time since her fear had taken root all those years ago, Elena Whitmore did not lie awake dreading the morning. She found, instead, that she was almost eager for it to come. A carriage rolled up the drive before the morning mist had even cleared, and Elena watched from the drawing-room window as a stern-faced man in a dark coat stepped down, a leather case tucked under one arm. Her stomach tightened. The magistrate had arrived earlier than expected, and with him came the weight of everything she had agreed to the night before. "You do not have to do this alone," Charlotte said softly, standing beside her at the window. "We will be with you the entire time." Elena nodded, though her hands were cold despite the warmth of the room. She smoothed her skirts and straightened her spine, reminding herself of the years she had spent surviving far worse than a single difficult morning. The Duke met the magistrate in the entrance hall, and Elena listened from the doorway of the drawing room as the two men exchanged low, serious words. Mr. Ashworth, the magistrate, had a reputation for fairness that even Vane's family connections could not easily bend, and it was clear from the Duke's careful, controlled tone that he had chosen the man deliberately. "There are 3 accounts in total," the Duke was saying, including Miss Whitmore's own, and written statements from 2 former servants of Lord Vane's family home, who were willing to speak once they learned they would not be speaking alone. Mr. Ashworth's expression remained carefully neutral, the practiced stillness of a man who had heard many claims before and trusted few of them without proof. "These are serious allegations, Your Grace. I trust you understand what will be required to see them through." "I understand completely," the Duke said. "Which is why I intend to see it through, regardless of the difficulty." They moved into the study, and Elena was called in soon after, her heart pounding as she took the seat offered to her. Mr. Ashworth studied her for a long moment before speaking. "Miss Whitmore, I understand you have an account to give regarding Lord Edmund Vane." "I do." Elena's voice trembled at first, but she thought of her mother's warnings to stay quiet, of the years spent swallowing her own truth to protect a family that had never truly understood the cost of her silence, and something in her steadied. "He cornered me in the drawing room of this house 4 days ago. He put his hands on me without my consent, and when I refused him, he threatened to see my family ruined if I spoke against him. 2 nights ago, he did the same again, more forcefully, in the corridor outside my room." Mr. Ashworth's pen moved steadily across his paper. "And you say this is not the first time you have encountered such behavior from a man of standing?" Elena's throat tightened, but she made herself continue, laying out as calmly as she could manage the account of what had happened to her years before, in the household she had been forced to leave. It was the hardest telling yet, harder even than the night before, because this time it was not kindness listening, but judgment, careful and official, and capable of deciding whether her truth would be believed at all. When she finished, Mr. Ashworth was quiet for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he set down his pen. "Thank you, Miss Whitmore. That will be all for now." He glanced toward the Duke. "I will need to speak with the other witnesses as well, and I intend to call on Lord Vane directly before the day is out." Elena rose on unsteady legs and left the study, and Charlotte was waiting just outside, wrapping an arm around her before she had even fully closed the door. You were so brave, Charlotte murmured. I do not think I could have done it half so well. I did not feel brave, Elena admitted. I felt as though I might be sick the entire time. That is what brave feels like most days, Charlotte said, and Elena managed a shaky laugh despite herself. The hours that followed passed in an agony of waiting. Elena tried to occupy herself with small tasks, but her mind kept circling back to the study, where the magistrate remained closeted with the other witnesses, and later, where a summoned and furious Lord Vane was brought to answer for himself. She caught only fragments of it, passing through the corridor near the study. Vane's voice raised in outraged denial, the Duke's voice cutting through it, low and immovable, and Mr. Ashworth's steady, unhurried questions cutting through them both. She did not linger to listen further. She had said her truth. The rest was no longer hers to carry alone. It was evening before the Duke found her, in the garden where she had first learned to trust him, standing near the same stone fountain beneath a sky bruised purple with the coming night. It is done, he said, coming to stand beside her. Mr. Ashworth has taken statements from everyone involved, including 2 more women who came forward once word spread that Vane was finally being questioned. He does not believe Vane will escape this the way he has escaped every accusation before it. Elena let out a breath she had not realized she was holding. And my family? Will there be trouble for them, for my part in this? None, the Duke said firmly. I have already written to your mother myself, explaining that you acted with great courage, and that your position here, and your family's circumstances, are secure regardless of the outcome. Elena turned to look at him fully, searching his face in the fading light. You did not have to do any of this. You are a Duke. You could have simply sent Vane away quietly, and let the matter end there, the way it always ends for men like him. I could have, he agreed. But I have watched you these past days, Elena. I have watched you carry a fear that was never yours to carry alone, a fear built by a man who was never held accountable, and by a world that decided his comfort mattered more than your safety. I could not, in good conscience, let another man walk away from the same crime unpunished, simply because it was easier. Elena's eyes filled with tears she did not try to hide this time. Thank you, she whispered. I do not think I have said that enough these past days. Thank you for believing me. Thank you for not letting my fear be the end of my story. The Duke reached out, hesitating only a moment before gently taking her hand in his. It is not the end of your story, Elena. I rather think, if you will allow it, that it might only be the beginning. She looked down at their joined hands, at the warmth of his grip after so many years of dreading a man's touch, and found, to her quiet astonishment, that she felt no fear at all, only a fragile, growing hope, blooming slowly in a heart she had thought too guarded to ever hold it again. Behind them, in the house, word was already spreading among the staff and remaining guests that Lord Vane's carriage had been summoned for a hasty departure, his reputation already beginning to crumble under the weight of testimony too numerous and too consistent to dismiss. For the first time in years, a man of standing was being made to answer for what he had done, and for the first time in years, Elena Whitmore allowed herself to believe that the truth, spoken at last, might finally be enough. 3 weeks later, a knock at the drawing-room door made Elena look up sharply from her needlework, her heart giving the old, familiar jolt before her mind caught up with the sound. It was only a footman, delivering the morning post, and Elena let out a slow breath, smiling faintly at herself. The flinch was still there, but it no longer ruled her the way it once had. She was learning, slowly, that a knock at a door could simply be a knock at a door. Among the letters was one from Mr. Ashworth, and Elena's hands trembled slightly as she broke the seal, Charlotte leaning close to read over her shoulder. Lord Edmund Vane, the letter read, had been formally stripped of his standing within the circles that had once protected him. The weight of the testimonies, gathered carefully and presented without flinching, had proven impossible for even his family's influence to bury. He had left London entirely, his reputation in ruins, and 2 of the women who had suffered under his conduct had already begun to rebuild their lives with the modest settlements the courts had ordered in their favor. Elena read the letter twice, then set it down with hands that no longer shook from fear, but from something closer to relief. He cannot hurt anyone else now, she said quietly. Not the way he hurt me, not the way he hurt those other women. No, Charlotte agreed, squeezing her hand. He cannot. The Duke found them there a short while later, having heard the news himself through his own correspondence, and something in his face, when he looked at Elena, was different than it had been even a day before, softer and more open, as though a weight he too had been carrying had finally eased. You have given something to this family beyond what you were ever asked to give, Elena, he said, when Charlotte had tactfully excused herself to see about the tea. "I do not simply mean the truth you spoke against Vane. I mean the courage it took to speak it at all, after everything that was done to silence you before." Elena studied his face, searching for the words to answer him, and found that for once, they came easily. "I could not have spoken it here, Alistair, if you had not first shown me that this house was different, that you were different." It was the first time she had used his given name, and she saw the effect of it land, warm and unmistakable, in the way his expression shifted. "I have grown rather fond of hearing my name in your voice," he admitted, a faint smile touching his mouth for the first time in what felt like days. "I hope you will allow me to hear it often, in the years ahead." Elena's breath caught. "What are you asking me, Your Grace?" "Alistair," he corrected gently, and she laughed, a real laugh, unguarded and bright, the kind she had not allowed herself in years. "I am asking, Elena, whether you might consider staying at Grantham Hall, not as my sister's companion, but as something far closer to my own heart. I know it is soon. I know you have spent years learning not to trust easily, and I do not ask you to set that caution aside overnight. I only ask that you allow me the chance to earn the rest of your trust, slowly, for as long as it takes." Elena looked at him for a long moment, at the steady, patient sincerity that had never once wavered since the day she arrived, frightened and guarded, at his door. She thought of her mother's warnings, of the debt that had first sent her here, of the fear that had followed her across every threshold she had crossed for years, and she thought, too, of how none of that fear had followed her into this room, into this moment, into the warmth of his open, waiting hand. "I would like that very much," she said softly. "I would like to stay, Alistair, not out of duty and not out of debt, but because for the first time in longer than I can remember, I am not afraid." He drew her hand gently to his lips, his eyes never leaving hers, and Elena felt the last, lingering shadow of her old fear dissolve completely, replaced by something steady and warm and entirely her own. Word of the engagement spread through the household within days, met with genuine joy from every corner, even from Mrs. Bellwether, who found herself, much to her own visible surprise, dabbing at her eyes when Elena passed her in the corridor. Margaret Whitmore arrived a fortnight later, overwhelmed with relief and no small amount of guilt when she finally understood the full weight of what her daughter had carried silently for years, and what it had cost her to finally set it down. "I did not know," Margaret said, holding her daughter's hands tightly in the drawing room where it had all nearly gone so wrong. "I did not know how much you were hiding, and I am sorry I never asked." "You are asking now," Elena said gently. "That is enough." In the months that followed, Grantham Hall settled into a new rhythm, one built not on old fears carefully hidden, but on trust slowly, deliberately earned. Elena walked its corridors without counting doors. She sat in rooms with her back to the window, and did not flinch at the sound of raised voices from the garden below. She had not forgotten what had been done to her, not entirely, not ever completely. But she had learned, at last, that fear did not have to be carried in silence, and that the right kind of courage, the kind shared rather than shouldered alone, could carve a path even through the deepest shadows. On a bright morning in early spring, Elena stood once more beside the old stone fountain where so much of her courage had first taken root, dressed in soft ivory, Charlotte fussing happily over the ribbons in her hair, and watched Alistair walk toward her with the same steady, unwavering certainty he had shown her from the very first day. She was no longer the frightened young woman who had arrived at Grantham Hall counting exits and hiding flinches behind a careful smile. She was simply Elena, standing in the sunlight, unafraid, and utterly, completely home. A crash of dropped silverware echoed from the kitchen below, and Elena's shoulders tensed for only half a heartbeat before she caught herself, smiling faintly at how far she had come. A year ago, that same sound would have sent her heart racing for a full minute. Now it was simply a clumsy footman and a dropped tray, nothing more, and she returned her attention to the letter spread across the desk before her without another thought. Grantham Hall in early winter was a different house than the one Elena had first arrived at, though its stone walls and long corridors remained unchanged. It was the feeling of the place that had shifted, warmer now, fuller, alive with a kind of ease Elena had never expected to find within its walls when she first stepped down from that carriage, frightened and bracing herself for the worst. She was now several months into her marriage, and the title that came with it, Duchess of Grantham, still felt faintly unfamiliar on her tongue, though the staff had long since stopped hesitating over it. She had used the past year carefully, not only building her life with Alistair, but continuing the quiet, determined work that had begun the night Vane was finally exposed. With Alistair's support and Charlotte's tireless enthusiasm, Elena had established a small fund within the county, intended to help women in service who found themselves in situations much like the one she had once faced, women without the standing or the resources to be believed when they spoke against powerful men. It had begun modestly, with only a handful of cases in its first months, but already 3 young women had found safe positions and fair hearings because of it, protections Elena herself had never had until she arrived at Grantham Hall. "You are frowning at that letter, as though it has personally offended you," Alistair said, coming into the study and settling into the chair across from her desk, a stack of his own correspondence tucked under one arm. "It is from Mr. Ashworth," Elena said, setting it down with a small, satisfied smile. "Lord Vane has attempted, once again, to purchase his way back into society through a distant cousin's introduction. Once again, it has failed rather spectacularly." "Good," Alistair said, with the same quiet, unwavering satisfaction he had shown from the very first night he confronted Vane in the corridor. "Some doors ought to remain closed." Elena set the letter aside and studied her husband for a moment, the steady gray eyes that had first looked at her with such careful concern, now looking at her with nothing but open affection. "Do you ever think of that first day? When I nearly walked straight into you in the corridor, half convinced you would be just another man to fear?" "Often," he admitted. "I think of the way you flinched at my greeting, and how it took every ounce of my restraint not to ask you, right then, what had put such fear into someone so young." He reached across the desk and took her hand, turning it gently in his. "I am glad, every day, that you allowed me the chance to learn the answer slowly, rather than demanding it all at once. You were patient with me," Elena said softly. "No one had ever been patient with me before. I did not know what to do with it at first. And now? Now I have learned to expect it," she said, smiling, "which is rather more than I ever expected of my life, before I came here." Charlotte appeared in the doorway a moment later, breathless and beaming, a letter of her own clutched in her hand. "You will never guess who has written," she announced, waving the paper triumphantly. "Lady Pembroke wishes to establish a fund of her own, modeled entirely on ours, in her own county. She says our work has become quite the talk of certain circles, and not the circles Lord Vane would enjoy hearing about." Elena laughed, a bright, unguarded sound that still occasionally surprised her with how easily it came now. "Then perhaps some good has finally come of all of it, beyond even what we hoped." "Perhaps," Alistair agreed, watching his wife with open pride, "though I suspect the greatest good was simply watching you learn, day by day, that you never had to be afraid in this house, or in any house that called itself yours." Elena looked between the two people who had, in the space of a single frightening year, become the family she had never dared hope for, and felt the last, faint traces of the old fear settle into something else entirely, something steady and warm, and permanent, woven now into the foundation of a life she had built not out of necessity, but out of courage finally allowed to breathe. That evening, as the first snow of the season began to drift softly past the windows of Grantham Hall, Elena stood once more beside the study fire, her husband's arm around her shoulders, and thought of the frightened young woman who had once counted every door in every unfamiliar room. That woman was still part of her, she knew. She always would be, but she was no longer alone with her fear, and she was no longer silent, and in the warm, snow-lit quiet of the house that had become her home, Elena Whitmore, now Elena Grantham, finally understood what safety truly felt like. It felt, she thought, exactly like this.